Alright, so we are going to look at Buddhism next. And the best way that I can sum up as a subtitle of what Buddhism is the way of the Dharma, the way of the path to liberation. You can see the reclining Buddha here in the main picture. It's the story of the death of the Buddha when he ate some spoiled food, and he's reclining, awaiting death, but he's at peace. He's offered his message through his long ministry, and he is entering enlightenment through death. Different Buddhist groups hold that enlightenment or liberation is obtained in this life, and others believe in the next life go round. Let's look at a little bit of the history of Buddhism, just a few important dates for the spread and development of the religion. So we have sometime around the 6th or 7th century, though we're not completely sure, we have the birth of the Buddha. It is actually Siddhartha Gautama. Buddha just simply means enlightened one. We had supposedly a first council of the followers of the Buddha after his death, but we really can't narrow down historically this event and all the details related to it. But the Second Council of Versailles, however, we have kind of a decision on the canon of some of the Buddhist scriptures and some of the two Buddhist traditions, the Theravada and Mahayana traditions, kind of split after this council. In 272 BCE, we have Osaka, who was the ruler of India at the time, made a conversion to Buddhism and brought the nation to that religion for a while, and then it started to die out later on. And then we have Theravada Buddhism, which you can think of, I just basically think of it as the conservative Buddhism, and we'll talk about the differences in a little while. But they were introduced to Sri Lanka and then other South Asian countries like Cambodia and Thailand. So most of these countries will have the Theravada style of Buddhism, and we'll look at that in just a moment. Then flipping over to the Common Era, we have the spread of Buddhism in China fairly early on, then into Korea, and then Japan. For a while it was the state religion until Shinto really developed and kind of oppressed all the religions in Japan, both Buddhism and Christianity. Then we have the spread of Buddhism in Tibet and Nepal area, those two, northern India as well. This is a very unique, though not terribly unique, brand of Buddhism called Lamaism or Tibetan Buddhism. Essentially what makes them different is they believe that the essence of their leader or guru, the Dalai Lama, is reincarnated after their death. So they look, whenever their Dalai Lama or their guru, or their Lama, if they have a teacher, dies, they look for a young child who might have the reincarnation of their teacher. But other than that, they're kind of amalgamism of many different strands of Buddhism. And then we have a decline of Buddhism sometime in the medieval period, and Buddhism did kind of come back in Japan in the modern era in the 16th, 17th centuries. Tibet was ruled by a series of the Dalai Lamas. The different khans in the east basically gave Tibet over to the Dalai Lamas to rule until, of course, the 1950s when China took it back. And then, of course, in the modern period, in the 20th century, 21st century, Buddhism comes to the West, and it's very prevalent in the United States, both with converts that are native here, and then also others from the East bringing the religion to the West. And then in 1949, China, the communist takeover, persecuted Buddhism as well as persecuting Christianity and other religions. Okay, so the two traditions in Buddhism can be summed up with the Dharma and the Sangha. The Dharma is the eternal law. We've seen this word before when we talked about Hinduism. It means kind of the same thing, but the Dharma in Buddhism is the eternal law of the Buddha that he discovered, that all reality is essentially an illusion, and that ignorance, that there is no self, is the ultimate solution to life's great problems, great miseries, and also big questions. And then the Sangha is simply the community of the faithful. So these are what we would think of as the Buddhist community at large. So as I mentioned before, the Buddha simply means the enlightened one, and it was Siddhartha Gautama originally who founded the religion. He was born in the northern part of India and southern Nepal. He was of a higher caste system. Many accounts, traditionally say that he was actually a prince whose father ruled a small kingdom in Nepal. While his mother was pregnant with him, she had a dream of an elephant piercing her side, and the baby Buddha being born out of her side. And the priest predicted the birth either as a great teacher or a monarch. So he was either going to be a great king or a great religious teacher and founder. The Hindu sage Asita was also rumored to have predicted his rise as well later on. And of course the Buddha left as a young man to go seek enlightenment. He did marry young. At 16, supposedly, he married his cousin. He had a son, but then he left. He left because he saw four sights when he actually ventured outside the palace. He saw an old man leaning on a staff as he walked, obviously in pain. He saw a sick man suffering in pain. Then he saw a human corpse being carried off to a funeral pyre. And then he saw a calm ascetic monk with a clean-shaven head, wearing a yellow robe, seemingly at peace. You have to remember, he lived a very sheltered life. And so all these different things in human existence that are difficult, painful, agonizing at times, like sickness, disease, age, death. This was all new experience for the Buddha. So he left house and home, became a beggar, and became a wandering ascetic, essentially. He went on his great quest for truth. He sought tutelage under a famous Hindu sage, Alar Kalama, and he pondered the realm of nothingness. Another sage taught him the realm of neither perception nor non-perception. None of these particular approaches to enlightenment or liberation from death and disease and pain worked for him. And then finally he tried severe austerity for many years. Ascetic austerity, limiting his food intake, his water intake, meditating throughout the elements in difficult positions, undergoing self-torture in many ways. He went in with a school of 5 ascetics when he was doing this, and eventually he got to the point where he was actually kind of near death, and he decided, I'm going to sit underneath this Bodhi tree until I have obtained enlightenment. He went through 3 temptations, essentially. This story varies from different tradition to tradition, but I've chosen this particular strand of the story to share today. So, under the Bodhi tree, he was tempted by Mara. Mara is a demon tempter. First, Mara told him that chaos broke out at home. He must leave the Bodhi tree and leave his quest for enlightenment to go and take care of business at home. Siddhartha stood still. Second, he was paraded. Mara paraded 3 voluptuous dancers before him to tempt him sexually, and the Buddha also rejected him. And then Mara summoned a host of demons to scare him and terrify him. But the Buddha remained resilient. He resisted Mara. Mara fled. And then next, the Buddha obtained enlightenment. So after Mara left, he fell into a deep meditation. He saw visions of former existences, and he discovered the cycle of rebirth. And we'll talk about rebirth in Buddhism in just a moment and how it differs from Hinduism. But at the age of 35, after around 5 or 6 years of seeking his quest for enlightenment through austerity and other philosophical perspectives and schools of thought, he attained enlightenment. He used the analogy of the lotus pond to describe how he approached enlightenment, how others can approach enlightenment from different paths. The lotus grows on top of murky water. The roots take root down below the water into the bed of the ground, and the flower floats up top. All the while, the lotus is always a lotus. But if you look at the lotus from under the water, in the murky, dirty water, all you see is just a plant stem coming out from the ground. But if you look on top of the water, you see a beautiful, bloomed lotus. Beauty is floating on top of the surface, but if you look at it from below the surface, it may seem different to you. So people comprehend cosmic truth or Dharma differently. There are many paths to enlightenment. This is why Buddhism doesn't have a very strict regiment for obtaining enlightenment. There are many different ways. But essentially, the Buddha's enlightenment came from the realization that all pain, suffering, and also extreme goodness and pleasure are illusion. They are fleeting. If we realize that absolute goodness and absolute evil don't really exist, that only our Buddha nature exists, then we can be liberated from the bounds and the fetters that keep us locked down and ignorant of this truth. We'll look at some of the other teachings in just a moment that will add to this idea of enlightenment and nirvana in Buddhism. But the Buddha obtained it, and then he found disciples. He found a monastic order. He converted many family members. And then he has these 60 arhats, or perfected disciples, that were the ones that really got the movement going, that also went on, I guess, preaching tours throughout the countryside, spreading the message of the Buddha and gaining new disciples. There was also an order of nuns that were founded by the Buddha's cousin Ananda. He was against it at first, but she convinced him otherwise. There was even an attempted assassination of his life by another family member, I guess, who wanted to take over the religious order itself. He had a long ministry, 45 years. He died at the age of 80 after eating some bad food that was offered to him. And then he died, he says, or it's written of him, although the Buddha never wrote anything himself. He says, "And now, monks, I take leave of you, transient or all conditioned things. Try to accomplish your aim with diligence." So, Buddhism spread very much. You have the Mahasanghika, or the Mahayana, for short is how it's really kind of known, which is more liberal Buddhism. Liberal in the sense of it's open to everyone, including lay people can obtain enlightenment. Whereas the Theravada tradition, the conservative strain of Buddhism, that's in mostly East Asia, you have the Theravada, which has the tradition of only the monastic order can obtain enlightenment. That's the main difference between them, but we'll look at some more details in a minute. Then we have the Buddhist canon of scriptures, the Tripitaka, and also later the Pali Canon were established as a set of texts. There's no authoritative canon of scriptures, but they do have a set of scriptures that different traditions of Buddhism have decided are helpful for the life's path to enlightenment. Also talks about here a few details about the spread of Buddhism in China. Theravada and Mahayana both spread to China. Different Buddhist monasteries were established in the 1st century. After Confucianism kind of took root in the 4th and 5th centuries in China, became more of the state religion, Buddhism was a little bit more oppressed. But Buddhism kind of came back later, less than about 15 years later, actually, with a different ruler. And we'll see with so many religions throughout history, the path that the religion takes in a country often has to do with who's in power at the time to regulate the spread of the religion. Then it spread to Korea in the 600s and 700s, and then eventually in China in 845, imperial edicts wiped out the majority of Buddhist temples and monasteries. Although you can still see many of them in China for tourism. And then we have the spread of Buddhism in Japan and Tibet. You can pause the video here and read more details, but I'm going to skip ahead to the next slides. So as I said, there's no sacred text or orthodoxy of belief that are strictly outlined and required for all Buddhists. We do have the Pali Canon of 45 volumes of particular texts that forms the core of traditional Buddhism, and then Tibetan Buddhism has actually 325 volumes of text. So it can be a huge spread of different holy texts in Buddhism. There is the Tripitaka that I mentioned just a while ago. It means the 3 baskets, so it has basically 3 different bodies of text to it. It has the Vinayana Pitaka, the rules of the Buddhist order, from monastic order that is. The Sutta Pitaka, which are dialogues between the Buddha and his disciples. And then you have the Abhidhamma Pitaka, which are teachings of philosophy and metaphysical instructions. As I said earlier, Buddha wrote nothing. We have his teachings taken down from his disciples and then passed on through the Sangha to other disciples. In Buddhism, there's the 3 jewels. There's the Buddha, there's the Dharma, the teachings, the law, eternal law, and the Sangha, the community of the faithful. If we were to narrow down Buddhism to just a couple of sets of beliefs, it would be these 3. First is the denial of the existence of a creator God. There is no deity in Buddhism, no God, except for a few strands of Buddhism that do have an idea, like the Pure Land sect of Buddhism in China. They do believe that there is a Buddha deity that's reincarnated, a Buddha essence. And then others have a more Western idea of a divine being. But for the most part, most traditional Buddhism does not believe in God or a creator God. There's just the life principle. So you can think of Buddhism as being a very physicalist religion. Although the idea of consciousness and mind is important as well. They're essentially materialist, where there's no spiritual dimension in the cosmos. There's just this life principle and this existence that we're living now. They also denied the individual's soul. So there's nothing metaphysically real in the human person. There's no eternal soul that's reincarnated, as there is in Hinduism. There's just awareness and consciousness of life itself. And then there's the third principle of the Four Noble Truths, the flow of becoming. So the Four Noble Truths can be broken down into 4 points, of course, the 4 truths. So all composite things are in a state of dukkha, which is misery. Then we have the state of affairs. There are the consequences of tanha. So tanha is the clinging to things, desire for too much food, or too much wine, or relationships even, desiring others other than instead of our own enlightenment. So we have the dukkha principle, that all life is in a state of kind of misery. It can be translated as dissatisfaction with life. I think that the Buddha had this when he experienced all the pleasures of palace life, but it left him wanting more. Then when he tried asceticism, he thought that getting rid of temptations, denying oneself, could also obtain liberation. He says, no, that failed also. So that's why there's this middle path that we're going to talk about in a second. So the state of dukkha, the clinging to tanha. The third principle is that tanha can be eliminated. So we can get rid of these selfish desires and this clinging to things in this life. The fourth principle is that there's a path that leads to this freedom. And this path is the Eightfold Path to liberation. Now this is not a strict path that Buddhists have to follow, but it's one that is preferred and encouraged to lead to liberation. So the middle path, and this kind of clarifies it. The Buddha says, these two extremes of monks are not to be practiced by the one who has gone forth from the world. What are the two? That can join with the passions and luxury, low, vulgar, common, ignoble, and useless, and that can join with self-torture, painful, ignoble, and useless. So that point of pursuing pleasure and all the accommodations to the body, and then also the position that says we must deny everything. So avoiding these two extremes, the Tathagata has obtained the enlightenment of the middle path, which produces insight and knowledge, and tends to calm to higher knowledge, enlightenment, and nirvana. So the first noble truth is a good quote from the Buddha. Now this, monks, is the noble truth of pain. Birth is painful, old age is painful, sickness is painful, death is painful, sorrow, lamentation, dejection, despair are painful. Contact with unpleasant things is painful, and not getting what you want is also painful. In short, these 5 groups of grasping at life are painful. The second truth, tanha. Now this, monks, is the noble truth, the cause of pain, the craving which tends to rebirth, combined with pleasure and lust, finding pleasure here and there, namely the craving for passion, existence, the craving for even non-existence. The third path, which there is a release from tanha, he says, now this, monks, is the noble truth of the cessation of pain. It can cease. Number 4, now this, monks, is the noble truth of the way that leads to the cessation of pain. This is the noble eightfold way, namely, right views, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And this is a quote from E.A. Burt that I really like. He says, being a philosopher as well as a great spiritual pioneer, Buddha discarded all claims to special revelation and all appeals to authority or tradition. He found a standard of truth in his way of discriminating it from error and the common reason and experience of men as they can be brought to bear on the universal problem of life. In the end, Buddhism is a very practical religion. Buddha wasn't concerned with abstract principles or conversations or questions about the existence of God or heaven. These things were useless to him. However, he thought that we could reason together about the problems that face life. Suffering, pain, these are what are real in our lives. And these are the things that we must really answer to and think about. He also encouraged skepticism to test his teachings, and that if you found his teachings to not work when you tried them, that you could discard them. So this is the Noble Eightfold Path. The Prajna is the wisdom that purifies, so these are the first two principles of the eight, right understanding and right intention. So under right understanding, there's the idea of the no-self. This is called anatta. There's no soul, no atman, nothing internal. There's no I in the human person. Individuality is an illusion. And the word for illusion in Buddhism is maya. Everything is maya or illusion. Right intentions kind of renounce attachments to desires and thoughts and things in our life. The sila, or the ethics, can contain in the next couple of steps in the Eightfold Path. Right speech, speak correctly to people with humility and love. Right conduct, of course. While there's no absolute evil or absolute good in Buddhism, they do see that there's right and ethical conduct, because if you can see the path to Buddhahood, obtaining enlightenment, you kind of have an obligation to show others that path as well. But there are some taboos, so they don't believe in taking life or killing, ahimsa. They don't believe in stealing, lying, immorality, and drunkenness. They also want to practice right living, so you shouldn't have a job where you cause harm to other people or creatures. So this means that if you are a businessman and you have a job where you're profiting off of the suffering and the pain of others, then that would be wrong. The next couple are the mental disciplines, the samadhi. This means right endeavor, suppressing evil, using meditation. Right contemplation, learn how to control your mind and your mental states to remain calm and at peace so that you're not prone to over-emotion. They don't believe that you should do away with emotion, but that you should understand the right context in which emotion should occur, and that in the grand scheme of things, though you might feel pain or sorrow in this life, that since it is an illusion, it's not your ultimate state in your path to liberation. There is a way to be free from that. So then they have the right concentration. So we have the right contemplation and the right concentration. You want to basically be able to control the mind to your will, to have control over your thoughts. There are different fetters or distractions to obtaining liberation, and if these are broken, then our hotship or enlightenment and nirvana are attained. So if you can avoid belief in individuality, there is no I, there's anatta, no self. Get over doubt, get over believing that anything you can do in rituals or sacrifices will save you. Impure desires, anger, desire for rebirth in a world of form, and desire for rebirth in a world of without form. Arrogance, spiritual pride, and ignorance. These things are to be avoided. These distractions will get in the way of your enlightenment. Then we have the law of dependent origination. This is, if you can kind of think of it as a cause to effect type of principle, philosophical principle in Buddhism. So what happens is that all of our actions that we do have an effect. And so if we are in a state of misery, it's often because we have done things to promote that cause in our life. If we've harmed others, we might be harmed. And so there's a cause to effect relationship. Everything in the cosmos, everything in the universe has a prior cause to it. And Buddhism kind of takes natural cause to effect in science, and they apply that to the spiritual life as well. That things that we do have a cause to effect. And this is the cause for rebirth. That because we don't learn the truth of our Buddha essence, our Buddha nature, throughout life, we cloud that up with our actions. And this is what causes us to have to be reborn in order to obtain enlightenment. So they took the idea of Brahman from Hinduism, and they kind of rejected it. So union with Brahman, which is kind of the pursuit for the majority of Hindu teachings, is to be rejected. Instead, you want liberation and entrance into nirvana. So what is nirvana? Other than a really great 90s rock band, it's a person who achieves right concentration and not subject to those distractions or fetters or tanha or dukkha. It's a state marked by a sense of liberation, inner peace, and strength, insight into truth, the joy, complete oneness with reality and the universe, and love towards all creatures. It also breaks the cycle of samsara. You basically, if you want to think about it, I know this sounds a little bit cheesy, but becoming one with the universe, essentially that's what it is. Instead of being reborn again, you just become one with the universe. You obtain liberation from rebirth. Again, you have to really think of Buddhism in a very physicalist type of way. Since they don't believe in a soul or a spiritual realm or God, there's this idea of a physical kind of reincarnation. So the goal is to escape these things and escape life. So I've already mentioned anatta. There's no self, no individual ego. It's a good quote from Visuddhimagga. Nirvana is, but not the man who seeks it. The path exists, the path of liberation, but not the traveler on it. So there's just life in Buddhism. That's it. There's just life. There's nothing else individual. It's monistic. There is one reality, one life, one existence. And the fact that we have individuality is a part of the problem, that we see that we are individual from other people. That is also a blinder, as it were, that we create for ourselves. Goodness, badness, evil, death, all these things are just illusions to distract us from the oneness of of reality and the oneness of all things. So samsara, I've already mentioned, the rebirth. So the individual human soul is not reborn into another body or a level of existence like in Hinduism. Karma. So as in Hinduism, there's a law of moral cause to effect from one life to the next. But you have to think about there's not really the caste system per se with karma in Buddhism. Buddhism is a lot more egalitarian actually than Hinduism, but our results in life are due to the actions that we take, and that can carry over into our next life as well. But there's not really a higher or lower level that you're incarnated into. The other thing too is that you can only be reincarnated into a sentient being, something that has consciousness or that's alive, so that could be an insect or a human being. So we have the two schools of thought. There's actually a third one, the Vajrayana, which we'll talk about in a second. But the Theravada is the kind of the earliest group. It's the orthodox school of thought. So the idea is that only the monk can obtain nirvana, and that Buddha was merely a man who realized his Buddhahood. Then you have the Mahayana, which I kind of crassly call it the more liberal strand of Buddhism, but it really is. Anyone can obtain Buddhahood, even a layman who's not a monk living in a monastery. And there's more of this idea, instead of Buddha just being a man, that there's a Buddha essence that's reincarnated into different people, different religious leaders, and different Buddhas and teachers. So Buddha actually is one who postpones entrance into nirvana to help others obtain enlightenment. So one who is a savior type figure. There's been many saviors in this strand of Buddhism. I call them bodhisattvas, and this can be a teacher. Even Jesus can be a bodhisattva for a Buddhist. And then Tibet and Mongolia had the Vajrayana strand there's a deity, the Vajrayana Sita. And this branch kind of takes several different strands of Buddhism, but it's kind of the fast track, if you will, to enlightenment through practices, mostly meditation and ethical practices, less focus on philosophical speculation. But you can obtain enlightenment, studying under a guru or a lama, and obtain enlightenment much faster than spending a whole life trying to do it. So this is a quote that kind of relates from the Buddha, that relates to the Mahayana strand. So at all costs I must bear the burdens of all beings, and that I do not follow my own inclinations. I have made the vow to save all human beings, or all beings. All beings I must set free. The whole world of living beings I must rescue from the terrors of birth, of old age, of sickness, of death and rebirth, of all kinds of moral offense, of all states of woe, of the whole cycle of birth and death, of the jungle of false views, of the loss of wholesome dharmas, the concomitants of ignorance. From all these terrors I must rescue all beings. I will experience in all the states of woe found in any world system all the abodes of suffering, and I must not cheat all beings out of my store of merit. This is also the foundation of ethics in Buddhism, that for those who obtain Buddhahood, which can be anybody, there's an obligation to not withhold that knowledge and wisdom to yourself, but to show others that path. Okay. Some other schools of thought. The Madhyamika. It's a philosophical school, kind of an Indian branch of Buddhism. And I won't go into it. It kind of has a little bit of the Taoist approach, where you have basically you transcend two opposites. So you rise above the paradox of being and non-being, or goodness and evil, by seeing them as paradoxically one and the same. So it's a way of obtaining enlightenment more through philosophical speculation than through practice. Then you have Tendai Buddhism. It's a Chinese Buddhism, strand of Buddhism, very important for China. But they have an idea of the Buddha as more of an eternal deity to be worshipped as well. And then they have certain teachings as well, but this one has the idea of the Buddha being more like a god. So another strand within Mahayana Buddhism, the Pure Land sect, also popular in China and Japan, you have this idea of a godlike Buddhahood. So you have the Amitabha, the Buddha of infinite light. He presides over the pure and happy land. This is like a heaven, and there's a rebirth. If you follow him, there's a rebirth into a Western kind of paradise, like you think of as heaven in the Western religions, Islam, Judaism, Christianity. So you must sing praises to the Buddha. There's a heaven and a hell. Salvation's by faith in the Madhyamika, and it's a stepping stone to liberation. So then you have Zen groups as another form of Japanese Buddhism. It's very strict. It takes away all the religious language and philosophical speculations, and it just makes Buddhism about focused meditation. So you can attain enlightenment, what they call satori, through meditation. And there's basically, no deification of the Buddha. He's just a man, and he realized through meditation that you could obtain enlightenment. Tantrism also kind of works from the Indian yoga tradition of enlightenment, that it can be obtained here and now and not in rebirth. So you can become a liberated being here and now. You don't have to be reborn into nirvana in order to be a liberated one, an enlightened one. Okay, a good quote for Zen from the Buddha. So friends, all of you, every single one possesses the nature of the Buddha. The good friends, the bodhisattvas, do not take the bodhi of the Buddha and hand it out to you, nor do they settle that has already foretold your destination, namely that all the beings are from the beginning in nirvana. From the beginning are they endowed with the gift of immaculate wisdom. Why do they not recognize this fact? Why do they wander in samsara and cannot obtain salvation? Because their view is obstructed by the dust of evil passions. They need the direction of a good friend. Then they will recognize that they are Buddhas, cease to wander, and obtain salvation. There are many festivals in Buddhism, like in most religions. I've kind of selected a few of the big ones that are celebrated in many different Buddhist traditions around the world. You have the Vesak, or Visakha Puja, the Buddha Day, celebration of the Buddha. You have the Magha Puja Day, or the Fourfold Assembly, or Sangha Day, so the community of the faithful. Celebrate the Buddha, celebrate the Sangha. And then there's a great, huge festival at Vasa in Sarnath, and it's one of the largest gatherings in the world, actually. And then you have the Salha Puja Day, or the Dharma Day, sorry. So you pay homage to the Buddha at the full moon, and then it commemorates the Buddha's first teaching, the turning of the wheel of the Dharma, in the 5 of 6 at Deer Park. And then, of course, we had the Buddhist New Year. So this takes place according to different traditions in Buddhism at different times of the year. But you can see that usually it's around January, February, March, sometime during these different months. They generally celebrate the New Year, and it's on a lunar calendar, so it takes place at different times each year. So that's a summary of Buddhism, the way of the Dharma, the way of finding enlightenment. It's a very eclectic religion from different traditions, different parts of the world, actually, and different perspectives on obtaining enlightenment and liberation from the big crises and issues of life.